Page 72, top of the page, chapter 16, talking about wings, talking about how Hashem takes a person's good deeds and links them up or plugs them in to what we call machshava tova, good thoughts. And this is not like the popular Israeli song. You know that song? Machshavot tovot. We're not talking about that. What we're talking about is, well, we've identified that there are two ways in which a person could develop a meaningful relationship with Hashem, and as a result of that, a passionate engagement in their Judaism. Everybody wants to be passionate about the things that they do, right? We don't want to just drag our feet through life. We want to be passionate. So how does a person generate passion for Hashem? Well, one of the things that we've said, and this is true for all things in life, you cannot have a meaningful sentiment towards something that you know nothing about. You could have a superficial sentiment. That's, I guess, why in the English language they have an idiom, falling in love, because effectively what they're saying is there's not much seichel at that particular point in time. The person's not necessarily so intelligent in their choices. They just fall into a situation which actually should not be called love at all. It should be called anything but, right? And if a person wants to have a meaningful relationship with something, a meaningful passion for something, then you need a meaningful and deep and developed understanding of what it is that you're looking to connect with. There are certain exceptions, obviously, biological exceptions, like your children. You don't have to understand them to love them. And some people will even tell you that the same applies to your spouse, and sometimes it's an advantage not to try and understand them, but that's a separate conversation for another time. Here we're saying if a person wants to grasp and have a meaningful connection with Hashem, who is effectively beyond our day-to-day experience. It's not like, you walk down the street and you feel godliness. And if you do, then you're way ahead of everybody else. So you've got to create that space. You've got to create that awareness. And how do we do so? Through deep meditation and contemplation. And we said the deeper and more profound and developed and consistent that meditation is, the more deep the passion for Hashem will be. That was the previous chapter. This chapter said, hang on a second, not everybody can get there. Not everybody has that depth of experience. Not everybody is so focused. Not everybody concentrates so well when they have to contemplate Hashem's greatness, especially considering that it is such an abstract concept. So what about the rest of us who are still on that path? We haven't yet got there. And just for official disclaimer, we're actually talking over here about the Beinoni, who is a very advanced person, and even the Beinoni, not every Beinoni is capable of this very deep, consistent appreciation of Hashem. So what do you do in the interim? We said in the interim we need what is called tevuna, and it's very important that we keep coming back to that word, especially now because that word is going to come up again shortly. I've got to be careful when I say shortly because you never know if it will even be in this episode, right? So what does the word tevuna mean? Not to be confused with bina, even though they are from the same root. Bina is a very profound understanding and thorough knowledge of a subject. That's bina. Tevuna is the intellectual acceptance of the value of an idea, even if I don't fully understand it. So the example that we use, we keep going back to this example. Maybe it's time to change examples. We keep going back to the example of the person who does not understand why on earth anybody would enjoy having flowers delivered to their door on a regular basis. So you don't have to understand it. You don't have to have bina, but you have to have tevuna, which is an intellectual appreciation of the fact that for my wife, that is something of value, and that's why I'm going to do it. So in a similar fashion, the person doesn't have necessarily this fully developed, profound appreciation of the infinity of God, and yet needs to have a tevuna, which says the most valuable thing in life is to have a relationship with Hashem, and the way to achieve that is through Torah. That in itself will get us going with a tremendous amount of vigor, with a tremendous amount of excitement, with a tremendous amount of dedication. And the primary reason why we'll have that dedication, this is where we're up to, is because machshava tova, when a person has a good thought is not the same as a good intention. We've made that abundantly clear in this chapter. Good intentions are impotent. And good thoughts are when a person makes that clear distinction in their mind between what is not so valuable in life and what is completely valuable in life. And obviously godliness is what's completely valuable in this context, and in any context for that matter. And so therefore that machshava tova, that recognition that I have in my mind that the best thing in the world is to have a relationship with Hashem, then Hashem will plug that into the actions that I do. So when I do those actions, they will be fueled. They will be energetic. They will be enthusiastic. Even if I don't really have the basis for that enthusiasm, Hashem will edge me along. That's basically what we've learned. So that takes us to the top of page 72, which is quite easy to identify because it's the end of the first line. There is a little full stop over there. That's where we are. And I need to put it on the screen, but it is not appearing as an option to put on the screen. So let's make it an option. Hang on. So at the top of the page, if you're looking on the screen, so actually now you've got to go a little bit further back, and there it is. Ach. Do you see that? First line on page 72, last word on the line. Ach. However, hadechilu urechimu she bitvunois moichoi v'ta'alumois liboy hanal. However, when you're talking about dechilu and rechimu, I don't know if anybody remembers what those two words mean. Dechilu and rechimu. We have touched on it before. No. It's not. It's Aramaic. Does anybody have any idea what it means? Does anybody remember? No? So, dechilu is fear of God, and rechimu is love of God. That's Aramaic. So, the bonus lesson, you get to learn some Aramaic on the way. So, dechilu urechimu, the person has fear and love of Hashem. I might ask you just very quickly, why do you think they're presented in that order? Don't you think it would be nicer if we spoke about love and then fear? Why do you think we speak first of fear and then of love?
Because we naturally fear first.
That's right, first. Exactly. The first human reaction is fear. Love develops later. And in a person's spiritual development, fear always precedes love. Think about it this way. What's the most popular shul day of the year?
Yom Kippur.
Yom Kippur, right? And in the same month, what is the least popular date in the month? Simchas Torah, right? And it's interesting because Yom Kippur, most people are driven by fear. Oh boy, you better get there, because what happens if you don't get there? And they're busy deciding your year, and you weren't there to put in your voice and your submission. Maybe... That's what? You're scared.
There's more at stake.
There's more at stake, exactly. Exactly, and that is the nature of fear, right? The nature of fear is when the stakes are high, the fear is higher. Whereas Simchas Torah, what's the big deal if I miss Simchas Torah? So what? So I didn't spin around the binama an extra time, how bad is that? What's that? Make it up the next day or the next day if you're in Chabad. So the point is that fear is usually our first milestone of spiritual development, to be fearful of God, not to be fearful of consequences. That is not a milestone of spiritual development. That's still quite immature, because that's really about me. I'm afraid what's going to happen to me. Whereas fear of Hashem is more along the lines of, I'm afraid that I'll do something that will displease Hashem or disappoint Hashem or disrupt my relationship with Hashem. That's much more mature. So that's the starting point. And so typically people experience Yira first, and then as we learn a little bit more and as we appreciate Hashem a little bit more than childish perception, then we start to feel love. So that's why it's Dechilu V'Rachimu. Now, we're making a comparison of here because in the previous segment that we did last week, we spoke about the fact, remember we spoke about the difference between the heart and the brain, and how essentially the heart is just a muscle. I'm sure the heart would be highly offended if it heard us speaking that way, but technically that's the case. It is just a muscle. It happens to be the muscle that keeps the whole body alive, true, but it is just a muscle. And for that reason, it is completely replaceable by another muscle, either an actual heart or a synthetic heart. Doesn't make a difference. As long as you can replicate the pumping mechanism, then you have the ability to keep the person alive. So for that reason, in the previous discussion, we said when something happens in your heart, it is much closer to your day-to-day human experience than if something happens in your mind. And it's really good to know this. I mean, we didn't say the second part about your mind. That's where we're getting now. But it started to make this comparison. So what does that mean? I'll give you an example. I had to go somewhere today that was associated, the particular location is associated with a very tragic event that happened in the community, and I had to go there unrelated to that event. But it was incredible walking into the space to feel immediately how my chest tightened, because that's how it is. When you have a very profound personal experience, you will feel it in your heart. That's why people say, I'm heart sore, heart broken. Or people will speak about their heart rate, or people will speak about pouring their heart out. All of those expressions, because we know physiologically that that is actually where we experience a lot of the physiological reactions to emotions, is in the heart. So for that reason, if something's happening and I can feel it in my heart, the likelihood of that influencing my behavior, my alertness, my enthusiasm is much higher than if something's happening in my brain.
But is it not controlled by the brain in the first
Of course it's
place?
controlled by the
Thought?
brain. Of course, but that's not what we're discussing. We're discussing where am I experiencing it.
In the
I'm
heart.
experiencing it in my heart. So in other words, let's say this. When a person speaks in abstract, in 6 months' time, so-and-so, who I haven't seen for many years, is coming to visit, at that point, you're not going to have a whole lot of physiological response. But when you're 6 days away, now you're starting to get excited. And every time you talk about it, you actually feel your body changing. You actually feel that rush. So for that reason, and this is where we got up to last time, for that reason, when a person has a very deep contemplation about Hashem's greatness that results in an actual feeling, the chances of that feeling motivating action are very high, because it's a real, palpable emotion, real, palpable emotions that I feel in my heart, which is a muscle, which is part of the physiology, the anatomy of the human being. That is going to get the other muscles moving. That's going to get the other parts of the physiology moving, and then I'll be very driven to do what I'm supposed to do. Whereas if all I achieved was this mental note, relationship with God, good. It's a mental note. So it's true, it's accurate, I buy into it, I subscribe to it, but I don't react to it with nearly the same drive and enthusiasm. So let's go back and read the line we've just read. When a person experiences either fear of God, and we prefer not to use the word fear because it has all kinds of overtones, so we'll rather use the word awe of God. So when I mean awe, even though technically awe is a much maturer version of yira than what we're talking about over here, so when I feel that this fear of God, or I feel this love towards Hashem, that is propelled by what? Tevunah, that word, the mental acceptance of the value of a relationship with Hashem, or the value of Hashem's greatness, etc. And when I have just that mental note, then it's going to be v'ta'alumos liboy. It's going to be something which affects me at a level of emotion that is quite dull. Ta'alumos means the hidden emotions. What we mean by hidden emotions, it's not like some kind of subconscious experience. A hidden emotion basically means it is there, but it is dull. And we all know this from our own experience. We have dynamic emotions, we have passive emotions. We have overt emotions, we have covert emotions. That's how it is. And I'm not talking about some deep traumatic experience that sits in the inner workings of your system. I'm not talking about that. We're just talking about it's like, meh. It's there, and I think it's important, but I don't feel my heart racing because of that importance. So what's going to happen then? You would think that the person would, as a result of that, not necessarily have any real drive. Why? So let's read further. When you are swimming in the pool of mental activity, you're a long way away from action. When you are in the world of emotional activity, you are a hair's breadth from emotion. Think about that.
Sentence?
When you are in the world of the mind, of intellect, you're a long way away from action. When you're in the world of emotion, you're a hair's breadth away from action. So let's just think about what that really, really looks like. So it looks like this. If you read a book, and the book makes a very good point, and you like the point that the book makes, and so you take one of your little post-it notes, or you take a pencil, and you underline or a highlighter, whatever it is that you do in your books. You highlight this particular line. What's happened is you've now effectively taken information and you have stored it in your memory bank. It might be something that you tell everybody. I read this thing. It's so interesting. I've never thought of life this way before. He makes a really good point in the book, whatever. And you don't do anything about it. So you might, for example, suddenly read up all this incredible data about how valuable it is to leave your phone in a different room when you're engaging with your family, and you see all the statistics and you see all the research and you see how it interferes with relationships and what it does for mental health. And it's so compelling that you tell everybody you have to read this article, you have to read this book, you have to listen to this podcast. It was absolutely brilliant. And while you're telling them that, you're also WhatsApping. Because the distance between the mind and action is a pretty big distance. That's why one of my favorite lines is that in theory, there is no difference between theory and practice. But in practice, there is. In theory, we could theorize whatever we want, and there's zero guarantee that anything will happen as a result of those theories. Now let's talk about emotion for a moment. And I'm not even talking necessarily about a healthy emotion. Let's say somebody cuts you off in the traffic. Now, at this particular point in time, you're not doing this whole mental exercise of maybe they're under pressure, maybe they're trying to just earn a buck, maybe they're late for an urgent thing, maybe they have an emergency. You're not doing any of that. You go straight to emotion, and the emotion is anger, which incidentally, in true Hasidic perspective, anger does not deserve the title midos. Right? Midos are human characters, character traits, characteristics. Anger is an emotional snap response. It's not something that is an attribute of being human. It's like a primitive response. Okay, subject for another conversation. Anyway, so person experiences anger. Where do they feel it?
In their whole
First in their heart. Your heart rate goes up. That's your first thing. Your heart rate goes up. Then, of course, your muscles tense. Maybe your pupils dilate. There's all these physiological responses that you have. So, nobody at this table, obviously, this hypothetical person who gets cut off by somebody else in the traffic, then decides what? One of the following responses. They're going to screech around and cut them off in revenge. Or they're going to pull up next to them and give them a mouthful, or possibly even show them some obscene hand gesture. Right?
All of the above.
All of the above. And then the likelihood is that the other person's just going to say, I'm so sorry. I did not mean to offend. No. So the other person obviously is going to say, well, you're the blah, blah, blah. Yeah. And so it goes. How close are we at this point to potentially action? Well, you've already done an action. You screeched in front of them. You've already done an action. You opened your window. Right? Because from emotion to action is a very small window. And that's why it's so important that people keep their emotions healthy so that they don't spill over into it. Because if we don't have a healthy emotional system, we don't know what's going to turn into what kind of behavior. Right? So, on the most positive, in the most positive sense, here's somebody who's got this incredible emotion towards Hashem. How close is that to exploding into passionate, enthusiastic, healthy mitzvah behavior? It's very close, because I'm on fire. I love this. This is what I care about. I see that this is the most valuable thing in the world. I'm going to always be thinking about it, always be talking about it, always be acting on it. If I have an opportunity, for example, to go to a shiur, I'm out of the door. I'm at the shiur. But the person has said, you know what, Rabbi, you've been telling us for many, many years that it's a valuable thing to go to a shiur, and I agree with you. In principle,
in theory,
in theory, that person may never get to a shiur, or they might get to a few here and then skip a few there, or whatever. That's how it is. Because from mental acknowledgement to action is still a long road. So in this chapter, we've spoken about what happens to the person who doesn't have the capacity to generate that real, robust emotional connection to Hashem. We said, don't worry, as long as you make the mental note that this is priority, you'll get there. But there's a problem. The problem is that mental exercise govu darcheim lemaila maila mibechilas hamaisa is way out of the league of affecting real daily actions. Ve'efshel lohem lislabish bevchinas maisa hamitzvos, which means that you can't really find a path to invest that mental acknowledgement into the actions that you're doing. In other words, when we say it's far from action, we don't mean you'll never do the actions. Of course you'll do the action because you made a mental note that this is important. Again, let's translate it into something we could all relate to. Going to the dentist. Right? So why do we go to the dentist? How many people go to the dentist because they have this deep, passionate love with a dentist chair? Okay, so why do we go to the dentist? Because the tvuna in our brain says, something you've got to do. If you don't do it, you're going to regret it later. Or maybe that little niggle that you've got in the back molar should be seen to before it becomes root canal. Whatever the particular motivation is, it's a mental note. So do we go to the dentist? Yes, we do. We might procrastinate, we might, but we go. So when he's telling us over here that from thought to action is this massive, long path, that doesn't mean you're not going to do the action. It just means the action will not represent or experience the thought that motivated the action. It was when I'm at the dentist, when I'm sitting in the dentist chair, I'm thinking at that point, this is so responsible of me to be taking care of my oral hygiene. No, you don't. You think, how long till this is over? Please God, let him not find anything. And give me a clean bill and 6 months of peace of mind. That's essentially what's going through our minds, right? Because when we talk about something driven just by a mental acceptance, it doesn't accompany us into the action. Now, if you don't have something driving an action, the action is going to be quite weak, and possibly not only weak, sometimes the action is going to be very sluggish. So it's not just weak, it's like really like trying to drag your feet through something. Again, go back to the dentist example. So you're there, but you're there almost kicking and screaming. That's not what we want. That's not the kind of Judaism we want. Who wants to have the kind of Judaism where every single time you're required to do something, every single time you're motivated to do something that Judaism expects of you, there you are schlepping along. I'm trying to remember who it was that whenever we would ask them, how are you? They would say schlepping. Right? So I don't want to be that person. I don't want to be schlepping along all the time. I want to be driven. I want to be plugged in. I want to be enthusiastic. But I don't have the mechanism because you need emotion for that, and I don't feel that emotion. And we can't pretend. You can pretend once or twice. You can't pretend in the long term that you actually feel enthusiastic about something you're not enthusiastic about. Right? It's then you get the flight attendant smile when you do that, right? Which is, the chicken will be, right? That kind of thing. But you're not actually feeling anything. And if you're not actually feeling anything, comes a time you cannot continue. You can't continue. So this is where Hashem helps us. But we're not there yet, so let's just go a little further. So lios lahem bechinas moichin vechayos lahalois in the porach elo. So what happens is when I have mitzvahs, when I have things that I'm doing for my Judaism that are motivated by this kind of abstract thought process as opposed to a tangible emotional process, it can't become, and listen to the language he uses over here, moichin vechayos. So we need to unpack that because there's essentially 3 terms that he's using over here. The first one is moichin, which means brains or intellect. The second term he's using is chayos, which means vitality. And the third term is...
Vitality or animalistic?
No, the vitality. Chayot, not chayot.
Oh, chayot,
right?
Okay.
And the third thing is to elevate those mitzvahs so that they can fly upwards. Now, that's an interesting topic in its own right. We did touch on this a little bit last time. What does it mean to elevate, right? We spoke about that last week. What does it mean to elevate an experience? So we're not talking over here about the heart, so we don't anticipate that the right language would be to say your meditation became the heart of your action. Doesn't make sense because we're not talking about somebody who has that level of experience, of feeling, of emotion. So what do we say? It should at least then become the moichin. At least it should become the guiding intellect that gets me doing what I should do. But because there's such a big distance between the world of intellect and the world of action, It's not likely that a thought process I had is going to actually translate into an action that I do. In other words, the action will happen, but the thought won't come with for the ride. So the action will be, and we all know this from experience, robotic. I'm doing the action. But there isn't that sense, there isn't that awareness, there isn't that clarity at that time. So if I don't have clarity, then I don't have anything to give it chayus. I don't have anything to give it life. Something has to give action life. And that's why the word robotic is a good word. So have you ever been to any of our major, what do they call them? Not department stores, one of our major grocery stores, I guess, right? Ever been to, like, let's say, we won't name and shame a specific chain, but have you ever watched the people at the checkout till? They very often look like they have left their souls at home. So it's just like, beep, beep, you know?
They don't even look you in the eyes.
They don't even look at the product. They don't look at anything. There's this vacuous, I'm generalizing, obviously, because some of them are really, really nice, but so many of them. So you look at that and you say, there's no chayus over here. There's no life. There is mechanics. There's robotics. Something's happening. There may as well be literally an artificial robotic production line, because that's effectively what you're getting from them. Or one better than that, one of the great assets of this country. Always thought, I often think, what job would I never want to do? Have you ever done that exercise? What job would I never want to do? Well, it's most of them, but one of the jobs that I think has got to be one of the most soul-destroying jobs, and yet in this country people do it and they seem perfectly okay doing it, is those guys who stand with a red flag just before the road works. And they've just got the red flag going back and forth and back and forth. What's that?
Fresh air,
yes, exactly. You've got fresh air, all the traffic of the N1 you've got in your face. So I've often wondered about that, and the reason I wonder about it is because there's this parable that's often told in Hasidus about the peasant who is offered a job by the king, and the job that the king offers him is, I've watched you working in the field, and I love just the grace, the way that you swing your sickle to cut the wheat. I just love the way you do it. I've never seen anybody do it like that. So I want to hire you to stand in my garden all day long and just do that movement, just that movement of the sickle. So the guy thinks this is fantastic, best job I've ever been offered, because normally I've got to cut and schlep and move and in the sun and this. Yeah, I'll be in one spot and I'll just be doing my little thing, and it'll be some artistic expression, and the king's going to pay me handsomely for it. So he's very excited to do it. And the story goes that after the first month he quits. And why does he quit? Because it's soul destroying. It's soul destroying to do something that provides no satisfaction, no achievement, no meaning. No meaning. There's no meaning. There's no achievement. What am I doing? I'm not doing anything. Nothing's actually happening. So if a person has no chayus, if they have no life, then they'll stand there just waving a sickle, or waving a red flag in front of the construction, or waving your groceries in front of the barcode scanner. It's all the same concept, where if a person, and I'm not saying people can't do these jobs with chayus, but if a person has no chayus, if they have no life in them, it will just be this arbitrary thing where at the end of the day, they don't even know what happened that day. Now we laugh at that and we say, oh, we are, thank God, much more sophisticated. We all, thank God, have an occupation that is much more challenging and demanding and rewarding, etc., which is true. And then we have to ask ourselves the more brutal question, do we possibly go through our prayers like the checkout person goes through our groceries? Which means we've just got words that just pass through. We don't even know that we've said them. I often feel that it is possible to go from putting on tefillin in the morning until closing the siddur at the end of Shachris, not knowing what just happened. How did I get here? It's not altogether different from when you drive somewhere and land up instead where you normally go. It's that same disembodied experience. So that's what we mean when we say no chayus. There's no life in this. All the pieces are there, but there's no soul, there's no life. So if there's this huge gap between what's going on in my head and what I'm actually doing, where does the chayus come from? Where does the energy come from? Now, what's the problem with doing a mitzvah or studying Torah or davening without chayus, without life, without real energy. So he continues. In that case, if a person lacks that life, if they lack that vitality, then the mitzvah that they do cannot ascend, it cannot elevate, which effectively means it's trapped. Now we need to unpack that because we spoke about it a little bit last week. We really need to unpack what that looks like. So I tell the story, I don't recall if I told the story last week or not, tell the story that the Baal Shem Tov once came to a shul, stood at the door and refused to enter the shul. And people were very uncomfortable. Why doesn't he want to come in the shul? So they said, please step inside. He said, no, I can't come inside because there's no space. There's no space in the shul. Everybody's looking around, and it looked kind of what it looks like now. One little corner of people learning, and the rest of the shul was empty. So what do you mean there's no space? There's plenty of space. He says, no, you don't understand. All of the prayers that never left the shul are clogging up the whole shul. And implies that it is possible for a person to say a prayer and it doesn't go anywhere. You know how often we say our prayers haven't been answered, but perhaps the question should be, were they delivered? It's not automatic. It's not automatic just because I said the words, that therefore the prayers go where they're supposed to go. It's not automatic. It's not automatic that just because I do a mitzvah, yes, of course I get the value of doing the mitzvah. Absolutely. But it's not automatic that just because I did the mitzvah, it was an experience that elevated either the item I did the mitzvah with or myself for doing the mitzvah or the experience of the mitzvah to be more than just an arbitrary action. It's not guaranteed. You need something to help it to ascend. Now, let's think, what does that really mean to ascend? And there are many, many ways that we could explore this. So I'm going to use a little bit more of an extreme version just to illustrate the point, but it certainly is not the only way that this could work. You get people, many people, who do things that are Jewish things to do. Let's use one that happens to be popular this week, Shabbos. So, why do people do Shabbos? And I don't like mentioning people necessarily by name posthumously, but especially if it might be seen as a negative connotation. But there is a very well-known activist who passed away tragically earlier this year, who is not Jewish, who spoke about the value of having a Sabbath and how we should all practice the Sabbath. And of course, Jews get googly-eyed any time that anybody who is not Jewish says anything that sounds like they actually like Judaism, because we're not used to that, so we get very excited by it. And so the next thing you know, everybody's saying, we really should use this as a way to get people to keep Shabbos. Now, of course, there's value in that. At the same time, we also have to remember why we keep Shabbos. Why do we keep Shabbos? Because it's a day of rest. I can promise you now, in 26 years, I don't know what a day of rest on Shabbos is. Right? You guys can rest on Shabbos. It's the rabbis who've got to work. So if it is supposed to be a day of rest, where's the rest? What happens to the person who lives 45-minute walk from the shul? So you're telling me walking back Friday night, then again on Saturday morning, then back home on Saturday afternoon, then again for mincha. You're telling me that person rests? Are you telling me that the mother who's got 3 little kids under the age of 3 and hosting a Friday night dinner for all her family and a couple of tag-alongs is resting? Where is this rest we speak of? Right? Subject for another conversation. Needs a whole share in its own right. But the point is, if my motivation to do Shabbos is to rest, then my Shabbos may never rise any further than my need for rest. Whereas if I'm keeping Shabbos, you know why? Because Hashem sanctified this day. And he created a way in which I could sanctify this day. So I'm keeping Shabbos not because of me and the fact that I'm exhausted at the end of the week, because everybody, of course, as is customary, says, I can't believe it's Friday again. And usually what happens immediately after that is to say, and I'm so exhausted. I don't know about you, I have this Pavlovian response. As soon as I open a bencher, I yawn. It's like the most incredible thing, right? So no, it's not about that. It's about I'm here to sanctify the day. I'm here to sanctify myself. I'm here to connect to Hashem. This is the day that Hashem has made holy. Then I elevate the Shabbos experience out of my world, and now I'm living a little bit in Hashem's world. That's what we want to do with every mitzvah. This is not a question of whether you fulfill the mitzvah and get the credit for the mitzvah or not. You get the credit for the mitzvah regardless of your intention. That's not what we're discussing. We're discussing is the mitzvah still living in my world, or has the mitzvah lifted me into another world? So if it is just some kind of superficial activity, how could it lift me? If it's not infused with life, how could it lift me? Or lift the mitzvah, or lift the object with which I'm doing it. So now, are we going to fault a person because they don't have the capacity, either they don't have the attention span, or they don't have the intellectual ability, or they don't have the time, and I'm sure we qualify for all of these, right? To give that level of contemplation we spoke about in the previous chapter, that is so profound, that allows you to have, so what, we're going to now prejudice these people because they're not able to have that degree of incredible insight and enthusiasm? No. The fact that I did the work, the fact that I came to the conclusion that this is what my priority in life is, at least in concept. Then what Hashem's going to do is, Hashem's going to take that good thought process that we had, and He's going to link it into the action. Not just that the two are associated, but that thought process now becomes the battery pack for the action. So there's what I am doing, and there's the value to what I'm doing that Hashem gives it. This is kind of like the person who steps on the plane and they say, it's your lucky day, you've been upgraded. In other words, I did my part, I paid my dues, but because I had loyalty, they upgraded me. And that's essentially what's happening over here. Because the person worked through to the best of their ability. They worked through a process to allow themselves to acknowledge Hashem's importance and greatness and the value of mitzvah, etc. And therefore, they're acting this particular way. Hashem says, we're going to take that, we're going to add it into the mix of your mitzvah, and that's going to elevate your mitzvah to a whole different experience to what you naturally should have been able to achieve. Now, a little bit later in the chapter, he's going to actually describe almost like geographically what that means. Like, where do we go? What are these different levels that we're speaking of? We're not there yet. So that thought process, those thoughts that got us to this extent that we acknowledge how Hashem is everything and the most valuable opportunity is a mitzvah, that's what we're calling the good thought. So it's very different to how most people translate it as a good intention. It's not a good intention. Why are they called good thoughts? Because what we're describing over here is an awakening, an arousal, an excitement for Hashem that is not happening in the heart where I can feel it. It's happening in the mind where I can acknowledge it. Okay, big difference. Now, occasionally in the book of Tanya, you have these little notes on the side, as you can see over here. And sometimes those notes are a little bit more cryptic than others, or a little bit more advanced than others. This one is a little bit on the advanced side. So we'll just touch on it briefly, and please God, next week, I'm hoping that we'll be able to wrap up the chapter. I know usually when I say that, it means it's not going to happen, but we'll try. Okay, so you see on the side there, he's got a Haggah, he's got a little note. The note is he's referencing two of the most fundamental works of Jewish mysticism, the Zohar, obviously, which is written by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. It's like the bedrock of the whole Kabbalistic system. And Eitz Chaim, which is written by the Arizal, a little bit more contemporary, 16th century. But some of the key principles that we understand about Jewish mysticism are in that book. So he says that they say this, very interesting observation. De tevuna, that word tevuna, is oisios ben ubas. Tevuna is the letters of Ben, a son, U, and Bas, a daughter. Okay? What does that mean? Shehein dechilu urechimu. So when he speaks about a son and a daughter, that is a code in Kabbalistic terminology to refer to love of Hashem and fear of Hashem. Why is that? So in this, and this you see specifically in the teachings of the Arizal, Chokhmah, which is the beginning of all intellectual activity, and Bina, which is the development of a very evolved and thorough understanding of things, those are called the father and the mother. Now, the only reason a person is called a parent is when they have a child. So we don't call them the man and the woman or the husband and the wife. We specifically call them the father and the mother because the objective of all intellectual process is that it should produce something meaningful, something sustainable. As parents, the whole point of being a parent is to produce another living human. So therefore, Ben and Bas, son and daughter, they can refer to love and fear of Hashem because love and fear of Hashem are produced by the intellect. And that's exactly what we're talking about over here. We're talking about where a person doesn't necessarily have this love and fear of Hashem that is so dynamic and awake that you live with it and that you feel it, but it's still there as a product. It's an immature product. It's still a son and a daughter. Son and a daughter implies they don't yet have the capacity to be independent, to be self-sufficient. They're still reliant. They're not yet, so to speak, adult. And then he says, the last part is the part that's a little bit advanced, where essentially he says, in the system of the spiritual hierarchy, the highest strata of the system are all the intellectual abilities. The next layer are all the emotional attributes. The next layer after that are the functional elements. And the last layer is what we call nukva, the female, otherwise known as malchus. Again, it's a little bit advanced, so I'm not going to get into all the details of it. But effectively, he says sometimes Tavuna is able to reach even as far down as that into the world of Malchus, which means to activate a behavior. And that's really what he's talking about here. So you have the ability through giving some time, doing some learning, paying attention to what you're learning, prioritizing in your own head the value of Torah mitzvahs and the importance of a relationship with Hashem. All of that can actually touch actions. And in the body of the Tanya, say not only touch those actions, but elevate them to give them a far greater value than they should have had of their own accord. So it's quite encouraging because it tells us at the end of the day, our job is to do the best that we can. And if we fail because of our inability, not because of our disinterest, then Hashem carries us over the finish line. I think that's a very encouraging thought.